Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here on a wonderful Tuesday morning when it actually feels like spring. So the book I'm presenting today is called Europe as Ideological Resource, European Integration and Far-Right Legitimation in France and Italy. And it came out last month with Oxford University Press. And in this book, the broad question that I ask is, how did the far-right go from the margins to the mainstream, and did Europe have anything to do with it? So I'll present the book in about 20 minutes, and then I'll look forward to your questions in the Q&A. So rather than starting from the beginning, I'm going to start at the end. So today, far-right parties are a fairly familiar presence in most European countries. They have entered several parliaments. They have been acting as external support in some cases, and in other cases, they have actually been in government, as is the case, for example, in Italy. So what is interesting about this is that this wasn't really always the case. So if you look at the post-war history of Europe, far-right parties were historically a fairly ostracized minority. In most countries, they were looked at as pariah parties that were going to disappear in due course. So these parties were very much treated as pariah parties. Now, of course, these claims that these parties were going to disappear haven't really played out. And the question in the book is really trying to get at how is it possible that these parties are still around? And again, did the process of European integration have anything to do with it? Now, Europe might seem as not exactly the most straightforward place to be asking this question, because we know that these parties dislike the European Union. But what we also know about them is that they have actually gotten great benefits from the process of European integration. So particularly when they were completely unable to gain seats in their domestic parliaments, they were able to be elected in the European Parliament. You might remember Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage never got into Westminster, but he was an MEP for several years. Another thing that the European Parliament has helped them with is these parties were frequently very, very lonely at home. But when they were unable to create links with domestic parties, they were able to find like-minded parties outside their own countries. Finally, and this is something we shouldn't really forget, is the European Union provided them with financial resources. Again, being a member of the European Parliament means that you get some funding, and it also comes with a symbolic advantage of saying, well, I've been elected somewhere. So European integration has actually helped them in several different ways, and in the book I argue that it has also functioned as an ideological resource. So for these parties that were looking for legitimation, European integration offered additional ideological resources that helped them reframe their ideology in a way that would appeal to both existing voters and to a broader public. So to study this question and kind of develop this argument, I rely on work that I carried out in my PhD thesis. So if any of you are PhD students here, you can now be confident in the fact that one day maybe you'll be able to transform that thesis into a book. So I relied on the qualitative analysis of about 400 documents produced by two far-right parties, the Italian Social Movement National Alliance in Italy and the National Rally in France. So if you're not familiar with these parties, the Italian social movement is very much the grandfather of the European far right. It was formed in 1946 by people who were previously in the Italian fascist party. And throughout its history, it remained a fairly extreme party at the fringes. But it was also reasonably successful to the extent that it was always in the European Parliament, in the Italian Parliament, sorry, and continuously from its foundation onto its disappearance. Now I speak of disappearance. What actually happened to this party is that in the early 90s, the reform-oriented leader decided that he was going to sort of transition this party from being a neo-fascist party to being a mainstream conservative party. So in 1995, the party changed its name to National Alliance, Alleanza Nazionale. And then it continued its march in the institutions. The party leader was actually the foreign minister for a period. And they very much became a normalized political actor. And in 2009, they merged with Silvio Berlusconi's center-right mainstream party and became the People of Freedom. The party has since been kind of reformed and now goes by the name of Brothers of Italy. And if you're familiar with Italian politics, you will know that this is the party that is currently in government in Italy. The second case study that I look at is the National Rally in France. So the National Rally was founded a couple of decades after the Italian social movement in 1972. And the aim of this party was really to bring together all of the various factions within the French far right. It was pretty unsuccessful for the first 10 years, and then in the early 80s, it started becoming successful, first at the local level, but then particularly in European elections. The party, again, is very much still treated as a pariah party with its own political system. But its image has greatly normalized, particularly in the last 2 years, since it managed to get a lot of MPs in the French Parliament. And this has really helped Marine Le Pen, who's the current leader of the party. Well, she's not the current leader. The current leader is actually Jordan Bardella, but she's still the metaphorical leader. The leader of the party is this program of de-demonization that she started when she took the helm of the party, which is really an attempt to normalize the image of her party. So the documents that I rely on were all produced between 1978 and 2019, which is when I stopped the research. And I rely on a mix of qualitative analysis, specifically morphological analysis, which if any of you are political theorists you might be familiar with. The core of this is to identify the concepts that parties use to talk about Europe. And then I use the insights of critical discourse analysis to think about how exactly did the way in which they talk about Europe make them look like better people. And the book is structured around the analysis of the 4 concepts that I identify in the first step of this analysis. The concept of identity, which I argue helped them transnationalize their message. The concept of liberty, which helped them stress similarities between themselves and mainstream political actors. The concept of threat, that helped them advance the idea that desperate times call for desperate measures, such as the one that they're promoting. And the concept of national interest, which really helped them bring these concepts together into a message that was appealing to their own core voters. So I'm going to start with the first of these concepts, which is the concept of identity. And what I find is that when these parties talk about Europe, the first idea that they rely upon is the idea of identity. And particularly, they speak about Europe as a broad civilizational concept. This is something that is beyond the European Union. It refers more to Europe as a civilization. You might have heard this in claims that Europe is Christian, for example. So this is really something that's beyond a political project. Second, they really identify some very specific boundaries for this community. In the 1980s and late 1970s in particular, what they were really insisting on was that the borders of the European community were not its real borders because Central and Eastern Europe was not a part of it. Whereas they thought that any country that was under Soviet occupation actually belonged to Europe. The other way in which they thought about these boundaries was by excluding certain countries. And this is particularly the case for the National Rally that typically claimed and still claims that Turkey is not a European country for a variety of reasons, but the big one seems to be religion. Finally, they also claim to belong to this Europe. So they don't just say that Europe exists, but they also say that they belong to it and that they identify as Europeans. They do separate, again, between Europe and the European Union. Particularly the National Rally from the late 1980s started saying, look, the European Union and Europe are not the same thing. We are European, and it's because we are European that we hate the European Union. And this is still a language that the party uses and that actually other far-right parties still employ. And what I argue is that the use of this language of European identity is very useful for these parties because it helps them dispel, sort of respond to claims that are exceedingly nationalist by saying, oh no, we're not nationalist, we're also pro-European, we have no problems with other Europeans, they are great. So it really helps them craft this Euro-nationalist narrative, but it still relies on a language that their traditional voters will find familiar. It is still very much a logic of us versus them. So we are the Europeans, those other people are not Europeans, and this really reflects very much a similar language to that of nationalism, which is this us versus them language. The second concept that they use is the concept of liberty. Now, you might find this one a little bit surprising, not exactly the most liberal people out there, But what they mean by liberty is not the individual liberty. What they mean is a collective form of liberty. And the way they use this concept is quite interesting because it evolves through time, and it really shows the way in which these parties actually respond to contextual changes as well. So in the 1970s and 1980s in particular, their approach to European freedom was a lot about reclaiming autonomy for Europe. So they thought that Europe had to be free. And the reason that Europe had to be free, of course, was because part of it was occupied by the Soviet Union, and they felt that it was somehow subjugated by the twin imperialisms of the USSR and the USA. What they add to this is this idea that Europe shouldn't just be free, it should also be powerful. There's a strong idea that Europe should be projecting power beyond its own borders, because this has been its historical mission. And this is very much where the MSI stays also in the early 90s. And where the National Alliance picks up this idea of a united Europe that is going to be powerful because it has a strong foreign policy dimension. The National Rally takes a different stance. Starting from essentially the mid-1980s and early 1990s, it starts shifting its position and increasingly talks about national self-determination against the European Union. So it's still talking about this idea of liberty, but it's applying it to the nation and using it to essentially oppose the way in which the European Union is organized. And what I say about this specific use of the language of liberty is that it's important because it helps the parties, well, first of all, distract from the fact that they're essentially nationalists. So it really takes attention away from these themes of identity that really define them and that people would recognize them for, and brings them into a domain that is perhaps less controversial. And second of all, it really helps them draw upon certain shared narratives of things that are desirable and things that are central to the functioning of a nation. Again, few people would object to the idea that autonomy is something that you might want as a nation, or that self-rule is something desirable. The idea of power is somewhat more divisive, particularly this idea that Europeans should be projecting power. But to some extent, it is also a discourse that we will find associated with the European Union. So it's not necessarily anything that is particularly surprising or just unique to these parties. So the third discourse is a slightly different one. So the first two ones, I would argue, really draw upon the ideological core of the far right. So the idea of identity and liberty are really defining of what far right ideology is about. The concept of threat is more of a characterization of the kind of world that far-right parties live in. And what I show in the book is that both the MSI and the National Rally, but not the National Alliance, use a lot the language of threat to define Europe. Europe, essentially, in their view, is always endangered by something. Initially, it's the Soviet Union, it's the USA. For the National Rally, it's also migration, it's Islam. There's a bunch of things that essentially these political parties view as extremely, extremely dangerous. And the idea that claiming that there's some kind of threat going on might not seem as the most straightforward way of claiming legitimacy for yourself, because it does seem like you might be overreacting. But what I think is really important about using this kind of discourse is that it suggests that we are in a desperate situation, and desperate times call for desperate measures. And these are parties that advocate for pretty radical solutions. So if you're able to craft this image that we are in a situation that is drastically different from anything that you've ever known, then saying that you might be more willing to consider an extreme solution, such as the one that these parties use. And particularly, the use of this language also helps themselves place themselves as the people who can solve this problem. And one of the reasons they can use that language is because most of them have never been in power, and particularly during the time in which I was studying them, these were parties that were excluded from powers. So they could confidently say, well, look, whatever you've tried hasn't really worked to address all these crises. Let me come in with actually appropriate solutions for it. So it really shapes the boundary of what you might be able to consider acceptable politics and brings in very much what they think these politics should look like. So the final concept is this idea of a national interest, which I look at particularly in what they have to say when it comes to their positions on the EU specifically, and how they evaluate the process of European integration. Here I look at the views on the principle, practice, and future of European integration, and essentially what I find is that when these parties have to make sense of the European project, they will always suggest that whatever it is that they think about it has something to do with the national interest. So when they express favorable positions towards it, as was the case particularly in the 1980s for both parties, they'll say that it is somehow in the national interest to actually participate in a project of European collaboration, and sometimes in a project of European collaboration that is actually quite strong. When they're opposing it against, they will say, well, you know what, the European Union isn't really working for us because it's not serving our national interest. And same thing in terms of the projects for future integration, which they think about, which, so for the MSI, the idea of future integrations was tied to a language of a nation Europe that should come together and be great again, essentially. The National Alliance rephrases that as a project of Europe of the homelands that recalls Gaullism and is a more confederal project, but what's really important to them was that there was a strong foreign policy dimension. Whereas the National Rally has progressively gotten less and less ambitious in terms of what is suggested for European integration. So in the early 1980s, it suggested a confederal project. It actually compared the EU to Switzerland as something that might work. And then increasingly, it becomes more favorable to things like ad hoc cooperations. So a more Europe à la carte type of union. How does this help them shape their more legitimate image, look like political parties that you might want to vote for? And here I argue that this idea of continuing to use the national interest is particularly important because it really goes back to the core aspects of what a supporter for these parties would expect them to do. So in other words, whereas the other discourses that I looked at to some extent help them go a little bit beyond their own voters, this one is a way to really restate commitments to current principles. So if you think about party change as something that can be very difficult to navigate, like for example adding a new issue can be quite divisive, in this case it actually helps them because adding a new issue becomes a way for them to restate their attachment to the core principles in their ideology. And this really helps them stress commitment and makes them look like people who would probably hold on to their promises if they were given power. So as I said, the book covers a period from 1978 to 2019. So things have happened in the meanwhile. And I think the three questions that I try to address in the conclusion of the book are, well, first, whether Europe is still an ideological resource. A core point that I make in the book is that one of the things that made Europe really function as an ideological resource was that it was a new issue, and one that was fairly divisive and on which these parties didn't really have a profile. European integration can still be fairly divisive, but it is no longer new, and these parties at this point have a fairly established profile on it. So it's not quite as strong as an ideological issue, but they still use a lot of the similar discourses that I identify in the book today. And I think it was particularly interesting to look at when Giorgia Meloni came to power in Italy, how she actually drew on the National Alliance and MSI's past, pro-European past, as something that she cherished and that actually demonstrated that her party was not Eurosceptic. So there is still this use of some of this language. Again, the language of a European civilization, you'll find that in Orban, you will find that in Geert Wilders. You will find this in a lot of political parties across Europe. So in a sense, it still can function as an ideological resource. It might not be as powerful, but I think it's still a useful way to think about how European integration has served the far right in some ways. The second topic that I address in the conclusion is really whether this should lead us to some extent to revisit the idea of these parties as Eurosceptics. I think these parties, we can very happily call them EU skeptics. They don't like the European Union particularly, but we really shouldn't forget, again, that they can distinguish between Europe and the European Union, and it's somehow useful to actually keep that distinction in mind. That historically, these were not uniformly Eurosceptic parties. And finally, that again, even if they might dislike the European Union today, they have also benefited hugely from this process, and this is something that we should be mindful of. Finally, I just wanted to say something because there's a European Parliament elections coming next month, and I expect that within a couple of weeks we'll start seeing articles on Euro-nationalist unions trying to form and how this is completely counterintuitive. Why would nationalist parties collaborate? And I think that this is perhaps one of the findings of the book point towards the fact that there are grounds for far-right parties to collaborate and to sell their collaboration as something that makes a lot of sense in the context particularly of some abstract European civilization. What I also hope this shows is that national interests will probably always trump on a European interest or any collaborative interest. So the moment they start experiencing some clashes, these collaborations are always going to run into some kind of trouble. So I think that is 20 minutes, 38 seconds, and that's enough on the book. I look forward to hearing your questions.